In this video, I'm going to take an overview look at Cascading Style Sheets. We won't do any hands-on in this video, but I'll have some videos that follow this where I do some hands-on examples. Also would like to thank Professor Robert Roque at the University of Cincinnati for providing a lot of the information in this slide deck. The benefits of Cascading Style Sheets can be explained best through example. Take a look at this page. This is a page I wrote many years ago that shows a list of plant results, and in this case I searched for oak. So you'll see that just about any tree or shrub that has the word oak in it appears on this page. If I hold Control and press P, it takes me into print mode and will show me a print preview. Now take a look at the print preview. Do you see how it's black and white? It doesn't have the top nav, it doesn't have the side nav rather, and it has a little different heading on the top, plant list from www.plantplaces.com, and then see more details at plantplaces.com. These are things that you see on the print preview that you don't see in the web browser. Believe it or not, both this print preview and the web browser that you see here is the exact same HTML page. The only difference is a different style sheet applies when we print than when we're viewing it in the web. On a similar note, Control-Shift-I will bring this up in developer mode in Chrome, and we can see that a different style sheet applies for mobile, something that looks a bit more mobile friendly. So exact same data, exact same concept, but we can apply different style sheets in different contexts to give our page a more appropriate look and feel for the way that the user is interacting with our page. So how do we make these styles? There's a syntax that we'll typically use and a lot of words around this, so I thought this little excerpt would explain it well. First of all, the entire unit is called a rule. And then there's a selector. Now the selector is very important because it tells us where this rule applies. When you think rule, think of a specific style. Maybe a background color, a foreground color, a text font, maybe all of these together. But nonetheless, the selector says apply this style here. This particular selector is just one letter, and it happens to match an HTML tag, the paragraph tag. So it means that it is going to apply this style to all paragraph tags. We can get more specific and have it apply to only certain paragraph tags based on an ID or a class or even a nesting level where that paragraph tag is relative to other tags in our HTML document. Once we're within the style, which is bounded by an open and closed curly, we'll see this syntax over and over again. A property, a colon, and a value. The property is what we are styling. Could be a color, could be margin, could be padding, anything else like this. And the value is how we are styling it. This entire unit together is considered a declaration. So remember some of these words, rule, selector, property, value, declaration. We'll see them on the next slide as well. We know what a rule and a selector are. So a style, if we take a look kind of at a higher level, it's just a consistent recognizable pattern. Something like material design, something like contrasting colors. These are all examples of styles. And then a CSS style is a collection of one or more rules. Remember what a rule is over here. And then a style sheet is a collection of styles. So we can have a CSS style, which is a collection of rules, and we can have multiple CSS styles within a single style sheet. Indeed, one style can have multiple property value combinations, and these will be terminated with a semicolon. Color is a really interesting thing that we can do in CSS, and I have a separate video that shows how you can get inspiration for a color. Essentially, take a photo and then use a color wheel to find the colors in that photo that are predominant, and then you can use that color to style your page. In CSS, we tend to have two different places where we will apply color. Color is foreground color, kind of like the color of a font. Background color, background dash color, naturally, is the background color. Unfortunately, there are several ways that we can specify colors in CSS. We can give it a name, we can use the red, green, blue triplet value, as we'll say, or we can use red, green, blue as hexadecimal. So there are many different ways we can use color, and the nice thing is that these ways I've just defined here are compatible with the output that you'll get from a color wheel. Box model is an important concept in CSS, probably one of the most important and one of the most misunderstood in my opinion. Reason I say that is a lot of times I'll look at an HTML page and it will have numerous BR tags in a row, which are trying to give some space between elements, because BR is a line break tag. But the trick is, you shouldn't use a BR tag for that. As a matter of fact, think if you need to use BR tags at all. We can do something very similar with this box model here, where we say we have some content. Outside of that content, we have a margin between that content and any other content. Then we have a border, which is optional, and indeed all of this is optional. Then we have a padding, which is the area between the border and the content itself. What's nice is that you can give sizes to each of these things. You can either give size to the entire unit, like a margin of 8 all the way around, or just one side, two sides, or three sides. So if you want some space below this item, you can simply give it a big lower margin and then keep all the other margins much smaller. If that box diagram looks familiar, it might, because when I go to developer mode in Chrome, you can see that I can select an individual element. Like in this case, I've selected the side menu. And it shows me the different dimensions based on this box model. Any kind of margin, any kind of padding, so on and so forth. This makes it really easy to go through and just take a look at your page and see where those margins are. There's a nice trick that we can use with the box model to give ourselves some navigation. Have a look at this list. Notice I scroll to the top, there's a little space for an advertisement, and then there are our query results. Now, as I'm scrolling, you notice that the top nav stays in place, and the content scrolls underneath it. Now, the trick is these are different divs. This top div here, this div to the left, and then this div in the middle. This div in the middle, we have to start right here. So we have to start it down here to leave a bit of space for the top nav. So that's essentially some top margin. On the left, again, we need to give a bit of margin to leave a bit of space for the left nav as well. Indeed, take a look when I select this content div. You can see what highlights in blue. Then you also see the margin in kind of that peach color, salmon color. What's neat is that it lays that immediately over the page. So you see I go away, come back, and you can see where the content is versus the margin. Now we take a look back down here at the box model, and we can see a bit more detail around that. We see padding of 5 all the way around the content. But then we see only the left margin is 165, where the other margins are not specified. So it's essentially taking this entire content and shifting it to the left by 165 pixels. As a matter of fact, you can see that pixel measurement right up here. And you can also see the padding of 5 pixels that goes all around. And see, when I mouse over that, we get a little green bar that appears where that padding is. And then we also have our top. We're starting down 4 EM, which gives space for this top nav. Now, one really cool thing about CSS in the developer mode is we can uncheck this and we can see how the browser would render this page if we didn't have all of this margin together. And take a look, it looks really clustered because everything is starting at the same 0, 0 position. So our plant list is overlapping our left nav, and then our plant list is starting at the top. We have our top nav, which is on top of that. So essentially, there's content here that the user will never see because the top nav is covering it. I apply the styles again, and we see it goes right back into place. Nonetheless, this little selector thing that we have here within Chrome and developer mode is incredibly powerful if you're putting together CSS. Form factors are actually really easy to do in CSS, and that's where you have a different CSS style for each different look and feel. For this to be effective, it's best to have the CSS styles linked. In other words, put them in a separate page, link them into your HTML page. Don't put them in line, don't embed them in your HTML page, have them linked. And you'll link a CSS style with the syntax that you see on these lines here. We can focus on one that is quite straightforward, line number 19. We simply say link, we're linking to an external file. It's a style sheet file. We'll get to media in just a second. href, where is that file located? And oh, by the way, this is text CSS. Now, media is when things get really cool, because media say, I am going to apply this when the user is looking at the page using this device. So print, we're going to use the print style sheet. Screen, which is typical web, we're just going to use our default style CSS. But if it's screen and it's no wider than 480 pixels, then we're going to use the mobile style sheet. So you see, this is kind of like an if test. It's saying, if this condition, then use this style sheet. And that's how we're able to have HTML that looks very different based on how we're viewing it. Let's take a look at the recommended print CSS. And one thing that we'll see used frequently here is display none. In that case, we're taking a selector and we're saying, in this context, I don't want to display this at all. The top menu, the top title, in other words, that navigation bar, the handheld or mobile device menu, side menu on the left, don't need that if we're printing out, and plant pics would take up a lot of color ink if we printed that out, so we don't want to show that. So you see display none says, for this view, just go ahead and hide it. I don't need to see it. Example here on this slide, this is essentially what I just showed you on that plantplaces.com. You can go to plantplaces.com, you can do a Control U to view source, and you can see this directly there if it's something that you want to borrow. Color. I mentioned that color we can use either name or the RGB triplet or the hexadecimal value. Nice thing about the name is that they tend to be browser safe colors because there's a limited amount of names. If you look at RGB triplet and hexadecimal value, believe it or not, these are both showing the same thing. As a matter of fact, you see 0 here, you see 0, 0 here, you see 0, 0, 0 here, you see all zeros over here. 255 is the biggest number. That's represented by FF. So triplet means a 10-based counting number system, 0 through 9. Hexadecimal is a 16-character counting system, 0 through 9 plus A through F to represent 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Just a little bit more efficient in storing memory because each of these digits can represent essentially 16 different numbers. CSS can handle any and all of these. And the reason why I mention that is this will work out really well when we're doing a color wheel because you can put a photo into a color wheel and it will give you either the RGB triplet or hexadecimal value. Now, one consideration, how many different combinations are there of the RGB triplet? You see that we have red, green, blue. Red can be any number between 0 to 255, 0 meaning no red, 255 meaning all red. Any number between those would be a shade of red. We have the same for blue. We have the same for green. So essentially the number of unique combinations of color is 255 cubed, or actually be 256 cubed because we have to count that 0 character. That ends up being about 16 million, which is more color variations than the human eye can see. But nonetheless, that's what we're capable of in CSS. We talked about how to link a style sheet. Let's talk about a few other ways to do style sheets. One is we can embed styles directly in the head section of our HTML page. The drawback there is it bloats the page a bit because we're putting style and content next to each other, and also it's not reusable across pages. So we can do it with a simple style tag, but really I'd recommend going to a linked style sheet instead. A little bit more on selectors. We saw that P selector before. Now here we see one that's an H1, and here we see a P, comma, LI. This one's interesting because it means this style applies to any P tag or any LI tag. Now say we didn't have the comma there. If it were just PLI, in that case it would only apply to LI elements that are within P elements. And that's how we can get very specific on how we're grouping our selectors. Here's an example. If you see EM within strong, that means it has to be an EM tag that's nested inside of a strong tag. And in that case, we'll give it the color maroon. Fonts are handy because when the web first started, every web page looked like a plain Word document, black and white text. Fonts give us a bit more style here, and it's kind of interesting on how they work. First of all, we can pick out individual attributes like style and weight, or we can say an entire font family. And when it's a font family, it's going to look for these fonts physically on the user's computer. And it will look for them in this order. So left to right, so you tend to go from most specific to most general. If the user's computer has Arial, it's going to use that. If not, it will drop to Helvetica. And if not, to sans serif. We can also style the font using some individual attributes that are represented here. What's the font style? Is it italics? Is it normal? What's the font weight? Bold, bolder? What's the font variant, small caps? Font size, more on this to come in just a moment. How big is the font? Font family we just talked about, Arial, Helvetica, sans serif, and then everything put together in the font. Font variant, one handy thing about this, there's some neat ways that you can use this for small caps, all caps, different things like that. And you might think, why would I want to use all caps or small caps on a website? Well, this is common actually in horticulture because there's a very specific way you're supposed to represent genus, species, and then order, family, and all of the different categories of the Linnaeus classification system. Very specific typography. Not everybody implements them that way when they're typing in, but you can have CSS actually show the text the right way, regardless of how the user typed it in. Let's think a little bit about size now as well. There are a lot of options here, and sometimes I wish there weren't so many options. If you take a look, some things are very specific. Centimeters, inches, millimeters, pixels. We don't like things that are very specific because they might render differently based on the user's form factor. Is it a printout? Is it a mobile device? Is it a website? Is it a tablet? Is it a phablet? Is it a watch? We want our application to look good on all of these different things. And if we're using very specific measurements, it's probably going to look good on one form factor, but not all. So one that's recommended to use a lot is EM. That's kind of a funny one because it's a relative measurement of a font. It's measured as the length of the serif on a capital I, as memory serves me. And so it's kind of this ambiguous thing, but it's also relative. So if you use a relative term like EM or percentage or something like that, it should look good on many different form factors. And of course, we know you can also apply different style sheets to those different form factors. A little summary of that here. EM units and percents are a relative value, increases and decreases in size relative to the parent element. I strongly recommend using those. And then point values are an absolute value, a fixed value that won't increase or decrease. So if you notice, that's a lot of time we spent talking about styling fonts because that's one place where we have a whole lot of options. Let's put it all together with this final example. You see we have an H2 selector, so this is going to apply to all heading 2 tags. And then we have several things going on here. We have our font style, our font weight, the height of the font, and then the font family itself, Verdana, Helvetica, sans serif. So you see you can kind of put that all together in one unit. Not every one of these things is required, so you can specify only what you want to specify. Now let's look at some ways we can practice with Cascading Style Sheets. First, you can go to just about any website in a browser, hold Control and press U to see the source. In the source, you can see the style sheets in this link here. And then many times they'll be linked like this, and you can click, and you can see the actual style sheet itself. So, based on what we just discussed, you can see that this is a selector for some kind of HTML tag that has an ID equal to, I believe it was top menu. And here we go, div ID equals top menu, just like so. Now you see that the periods mean they're matching up to a class attribute instead of an ID attribute. And then you see a few other things here, like anchor tags and body, so setting the text for the entire body, and then the font size for each of the H1 through H4. So that's how you can take a look at some CSS. Another cool thing you can do in Chrome is Control-Shift-I, which brings up developer mode. And now we can click on an element, or we can right-click and just choose Inspect, and it will take us right there. And the neat thing is it shows us what CSS styles have applied over here on the right. And what's really neat is you take a look at the behavior right now, but you see you can unselect these different CSS styles that are applying, and you can see how that changes the look and feel of the website. So you see now that's no longer sticky nav, it no longer has that green background, it's just flowing with the sheet. But then you can look and see what happens when we change each of these things, like when we re-enable the z-index, and when we go ahead and say it's fixed and position fixed, you can see how things differ a little bit. One other kind of handy thing that you can do with that developer mode is you can actually change what a website looks like that you don't own. Now, this is only in your browser. You're not actually changing the website itself. But take a look at this. I go to the Inquirer, go to the headline, choose Inspect. That opens up this Inspector tab that we saw before, and this is a fairly heavy page, so it might take just a moment. But you see, how can sports be more than sports? Which, sure enough, that's the headline there. Now I right-click and I choose Edit Text, and I can say, Brandon Jones is awesome. And now take a look at the headline of the Inquirer. Now here again, this is only on my browser, but that's kind of a cool trick if you want to get a screen capture and send it to your friend and say, hey, look what happened. The real purpose is not for that. The real purpose is so that you can test out your stuff in a browser and try different combinations of CSS until you get the look and feel that you want. So this has been a look at Cascading Style Sheets. Stay tuned for our next several videos where I will go through some examples. As always, I hope this video was helpful, and I look forward to reading your comments. Thank you.